Hey guys, it's Alexander Williamson here with The Secret History, living in your aquarium. So, today we're going to be talking about red tide. Now, we're also going to be talking about red tide in fresh water, which isn't really a red tide. It's a cyanobacteria, whereas red tide is an algae. It's a dinoflagellate algae, which is just a little, it usually looks like little snowflakes or little squares or geometric shapes when you see various dinoflagellates. Everything from phosphorescent dinoflagellates exist where they glow and where they use inflorescence and they glow this beautiful blue, to the type that use phosphorus, like I was just saying, that glow a nice green color, and actually they are algae that can pair up on land with lichen and fungi and cause fungi to glow as well. Or they can be in the visible light spectrum and have a red color, hence the red tide. Or they can have a bluish green color. So we're gonna go over why all the colors, what's with the colors, man, and what happened evolutionarily that is so incredible. And actually, we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for their ancestors, and our ancestors as well, of course. But if it weren't for an incredible event that happened, which was basically the mother of all red tides or cyanobacteria blooms. It's called the Great Oxygenation, and it led to life on Earth as we know it, multicellular life on Earth proliferating. So we're going to go over what red tide is, and I'm going to show you some cyanobacteria, and we'll go over kind of the details and actually how nasty that is, because it's been in the news lately. It's been in Florida, California, Washington. It happens in the lakes all around the world every year when summer rolls around, and we're going to talk about that as well, and some of the interesting metabolic reasons that occurs, which actually have to do with the color of the life forms, and how that can impact humans and fish and marine life, as well as terrestrial life in general. We're going to go over all of that. So let's jump right in. That wasn't very smooth. All right, so here we are in our happy little lake ecosystem, freshwater lake, and we're just enjoying life, and all of a sudden, oh no, cyanobacteria. So this is the same thing, the same type of bacteria, dinoflagellate, that red tide is. And basically, what you need to understand about algae, both life forms, are that red tide or cyanobacteria, which is also sometimes known as blue-green algae for the reason that, hey, look, it's kind of bluish-green and it's an algae, they use a really unique way of harnessing energy. So they take light, like this halo, this sun, they take the energy of the sun, and actually this is what plants and all photosynthetic life inherited. And at some point, something happened where literally a cell of some sort of algae was probably consumed by another type of algae, and that became a multicellular complex life form where the cell that it ate kept doing the photosynthetic thing with the energy, taking light from the sun and converting it into energy and sugar. And then it just basically got more and more complex from there. But it was most likely one of these early life forms that first did it. And in plants, it occurs and it uses oxygen, CO2, sugars, nitrogen, all sorts of different nutrients are actually involved when it comes down to the complex photosynthesis. However, in cyanobacteria like red tides or in algae blooms in freshwater like these ones here, what it's doing is it is actually on the cellular level, each little cell in a colony of cells, because this is a colony of life forms of little single cells working together in what's called a mat or a colony, and they actually are taking the light energy from above and they are ripping apart water molecules and stealing the oxygen and letting it off as waste, and then it goes off and can do its thing in the atmosphere. And then they take the hydrogen and they recombine that with other elements to make complex sugars and various energy storing chemicals like ATP, which is the main energy powerhouse of any cell in the world, really. So what's really cool about this is that before algae existed, before photosynthetic algae existed and cyanobacteria existed, the cyanobacteria is the only known life form that can rip apart water using just the energy of light, and it doesn't need iron or carbon or anything else necessarily by definition to create that energy. So what happened was, early on in Earth's history, there was only single cell life forms, and within a few million years of this algae evolving, this cyanobacteria and algae combo evolving, it made enough oxygen that it oxygenated the entire Earth and actually killed probably every bacteria and organism that was on the surface of the Earth, as well as many in the oceans. Because before that, life did not live in an oxygen-rich environment. Before that, all the life on Earth, which was not super diverse, not full of plants or animals, it was basically slimy surfaces of different colors that released various gases and elements, kind of condensed them into little clumps as each colony would work, and some would use iron, some would use sulfur, and so on. But once oxygen oxygenated the entire world, it allowed both photosynthetic light metabolism to occur in plants and complex algae rather than just the cyanobacteria, and it evolved into full-on plants, multicellular life. And also the other bacterias likely evolved into different life, like zooplankton, and more complex, singular cell organisms like amoebas probably turned into fish, and on and on. And ever since, there has been a battle raging. Oh, hi there. So, back to the subject of what this whole video is about, red tide. What is red tide? Well, as we said, it's a dinoflagellate, which is a little single cellular life form that is concentrated by the billions in water in our oceans. What causes it to bloom? Well, we know that nitrogen, nitrates, ammonia, nitrites, and various fertilizer compounds that are used in the agricultural industry, as well as just compounds that are naturally found in, for instance, the nitrogen cycle that you may know from your aquarium. That is what fuels it. Now, usually, all these little life forms and bacteria are in harmony. They're in homeostasis or balance, and the biodiversity that occurs naturally kind of keeps them in check. And they live in little clumps, they live in little groups, but they don't explode into the billions. And it's really when we get four things. We get warm weather, we get hot sunlight, or intense sunlight rather, and also, that's all got to be in water, obviously. And then we also get the nitrogen and the phosphorus or phosphate runoff. And these are the recipes for a massive problem. And why is it a massive problem? Well, first off, the most common red tide that's in salt water is going to be caused by an algae known as Carina brevis. And Carina brevis is a toxic algae. It creates a toxic chemical both to humans and fish. It's called an ichthyotoxin. Ichthyo as in fish and toxin as in toxin. And it can literally just kill fish right on the spot there. It's a neurotoxin. It's a nerve toxin that works on the central nervous system, and it also impairs renal and hepatic functionality, so liver and kidney. So this terrible algae, basically when it's in a strong concentration, it washes up on the shore and it washes in and out all day, and the dead bodies of that algae it actually starts to break the cell membranes. And the toxin in there, the brevotoxins as they're known, they actually are tasteless and colorless, odorless. The algae itself is red, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this toxin can actually come up off the shore, off the water that's being churned up by wave action and wind. And for up to a mile, 2 kilometers inland, people can have breathing problems, respiration problems, and it can bioaccumulate in various life forms. Things like bivalves, clams, and things like that, crabs, oysters, they have it build up in their system. And if humans eat it, we become very, very ill. So shellfish poisoning is another way in which we see red tide manifesting itself. And you've probably seen alerts if you live anywhere in the coastal part of the world where it says, don't eat these foods. But these same toxins build up in fish as well. And in humans, what happens is these toxins are these long chain chemicals. And they basically turn like a double helix when you look at this long molecule of brevotoxins, and they attach to the sodium ion channels of your neurons that are what allow your nerves and your brain cells and your pain cells and pressure cells and light reactivity cells, anything that sends a signal in your body basically can be impacted by these, and they bond to the end of it and misfire. So you either get signals of intense pain or no signal or just random stray signals, and this just wreaks havoc on the body of many fish, many humans, many different creatures, all up and down the food chain. So what's going on in freshwater? Is it any different? Well, the algae in freshwater, which sometimes is red, sometimes is not, is a little different. Now, it's a cyanobacteria rather than just an algae necessarily, and it can actually make you sick in other ways. So it has another chemical in it, which is known as pyridinin, and it is a carotenoid. And that's usually what's in most of these cyanobacteria blooms that aren't blue-green but are brown and yellow colors. And carotenoids are familiar to you probably because they're in carrots, so you've heard of them. They're orange and yellow, and they're actually an anthocyanin, which is something that we talk about in other videos on this channel because that's what gives red pigment to all plants and animals. That's what gives blue and purple pigment to the same creatures too. Just depends on the pH and the amount of it and the way light reflects or refracts off of it that makes the difference in that. And being that all these creatures take their energy from the sun, they are primary producers, which makes them really important. The entire ecosystem actually relies on these normally. So even when they're not in large numbers, they're an important source of food because there are many other species that eat these, even the nasty ones. There are many resistant other bacterias, other plankton, protozoas, and even larger life forms like fish that can actually eat certain types of cyanobacteria or algae or bacteria columns and colonies. Well, the reason they have the color that they do have, obviously, other than that this chemical is in them, this chemical is in them because it helps them photosynthesize different wavelengths of light. And when plants photosynthesize light, they use chlorophyll, and so does most algae, so does cyanobacteria in a lot of cases as well. But they have more tricks up their sleeve. They've had 2.5 billion years to come up with ways to get around the gatekeepers of the biological world. And the way they do this is they use different color pigments. And so they can use a red pigment, which then protects them from UV light in the red spectrum, the closer to the infrared on the lower end of the spectrum, and then closer to ultraviolet on the blue end of light. And this allows them to get what we measure in nanometers, which are the peaks. If you look at a light wave, which is a peak, a trough and a valley. We measured the distance between each peak or each valley, and that gives us a distance in nanometers, and that is the frequency or the bandwidth or the intensity of our light, essentially. And so usually life and photosynthesis occurs within a green, yellowish, a little bit bluish light bandwidth that's very specific from the sun, and that's what's most effectively used for turning into energy, for ripping water molecules or carbon molecules apart like plants do. Well, as we said, they only need water to rip apart, and there's plenty of water in the ocean or in a lake, and so they can go really crazy when they have those other two things, the nitrogen and the phosphorus, the only other two things they need to really work with that. And so they build up these chemicals which give them different colors of light just because of the way the light interacts with our eyes visibly. Some of it is scattered and not absorbed by the life form, and other bandwidths are absorbed by it. Now, the ones that are scattered are usually reflected back to us, and we see those lights. So the ones we're only seeing the wavelengths that it didn't use usually when we look at something. The wavelengths that weren't absorbed by that surface or completely scattered to a degree that it didn't reflect as one color back to our eyes. It would, otherwise it looks white, like a reflection, a flash of light, like when a car or a mirror is shined on you. That's all the colors coming at you. But the really interesting thing about all these life forms and the red tide and the cyanobacteria is those same life forms that created all the oxygen that's on Earth today, all the air we breathe, the life blood of life on Earth, were all oxygen life forms other than anaerobic and anoxic bacteria and viruses. And so any complex life, you can thank them for changing the world and essentially wiping out all other life unless it was underground or deep underwater in some corner of who only knows where at the time, 2.5 billion years ago. But now they built up, and over the eons, of course, they built up the ozone layer as well, which then protects them further and allowed even more complex life to form. And so then we believe that somewhere around 2 billion years ago, these really complex mats of these life forms began to form, and you get thick slimes like you've seen in your tank when you pull it up, and it's just, it looks like a creature from the Black Lagoon or something like that. That is the mat of all these life forms living together. And oftentimes they'll even incorporate other bacteria, fungi, and even small life forms and small algae, other species, into it. Now, these toxins and things, they're a real issue for humans, and we have to mitigate them. And one way we can do that is by not putting effluents into the water. So obviously we don't want to put waste. Fecal coliform bacteria is also very harmful, and E. coli and things like that. So we don't want to put human waste or animal waste back into the water system. Right now in Florida, they think that Lake Okeechobee is getting the freshwater blooms, and the nitrates, nitrites, and the phosphates that are all coming from agricultural runoff, as well as septic tanks and other industrial sewers and things that have leaked down in that region. And it then, due to the intense sunlight and heat that's always present in Florida, essentially, especially in the summer, spring, or early fall, you get these big blooms. And what happens is Lake Okeechobee has a river on either side that drains to either side of Florida, one to the Gulf Coast and one to the Atlantic. And the Army Corps of Engineers basically kind of engineered that lake and shaped it. It's kind of man-controlled, if not man-made. And so they pump out that effluent-filled water out into the Gulf. And as well as that, on the Tampa Bay side of things, Fort Myers side of things, you also have sewage plants and things. You've had some spills and things over the years, and it all just adds up into kind of the perfect storm to be causing this. And so you get the red color life form that's killing your poor fish with neurotoxins. And then when it's dead and dying, it actually, the bacteria that eats the cyanobacteria and the red tide life forms, that bacteria, sure, it's good. We're glad that it's doing that and getting rid of all the little bodies and things that are floating in the water as pond scum, essentially. But it depletes the oxygen out of the water. And so then we kind of start this feedback loop that can happen of die-off, where then there's no oxygen in the water, and the nitrogen's high, and the phosphates are high, and it can be a real problem. And we actually are looking into kind of re-engineering other algae and dinoflagellates and bacteria in order to recolonize these areas like they do naturally over time. The world and the nature out there, anywhere, pick an ecosystem, has a way to find, homeostasis and harmony. There are algae that grow on snow, that grow on glaciers and on ice. So it will find a way, and if there is a food source or a fuel source that's readily available, there will be something that moves in to eat that. But for the time being, and for a long time, all of human history, recorded human history, red tide has been a big issue, and it's getting worse because of human activity. So just keep in mind how we're all connected, and just kind of the interesting little tidbit that if it weren't for these same life forms, we wouldn't have the oxygen that allowed us to spring forth into more complex life forms. So we kind of need to thank their cousins. It's just kind of the rowdy member of the family that we've got to figure out how to work with a little better. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We can get into this a lot more in depth. We can look under the microscope at some of this stuff and actually talk about the more specific chemical reactions going on, or some of the physics with optics and light, if you want. So let me know what part of this is interesting to you, if any, in the comments. And hopefully I'll see you next time on The Secret History, living in your aquarium. All right, guys, I'll talk to you later, and stay out of that red tide. Bye.